Hey, folks.
I thought the recording always just auto started.
Yeah,
Did you
it
flip the
does
switch?
until you hit stop and then start again because we were. Okay, so Samir's got a hack doc, but let me pull up the notary meeting notes. And we can sign in here.
Yeah, and I can share a link of that hack. Oh, you shared it already. Thanks.
Is that the same? Actually, where's the board? Oh, no, the link is not for the board. Yeah, you want me to just put that in the hack doc, Samir?
Yeah, if you want to, or I can also put it in the chat right now so people can click on it. It will just take a couple of minutes to update as to where I am with the release management and project planning.
Okay. I've already lost where that is. Yeah, if you just paste it, I will. That's the one. Okay.
Yep.
I'll put it in the HackMD notes.
Yeah, if people want to read it for 2 minutes, I think that will help. The big discussion I want to have is on the high-level static roadmap. Last time we talked, I presented that high-level static roadmap as a table. And this time I went in and put it in as issues in my private repo right now. But then I want to have a discussion on it for a few minutes and then move them into the Notary project repo.
So just Samir and I were talking about GitHub projects and trying to figure out how to manage it. So Marina, this will probably make most sense, most important to you as well. The way we understand the way GitHub projects work is in order for them to do the automation for things that are issues or bugs in repos, bugs in repos, you either have to put the project in the same repo or you have to put it above it in the org. Since the way we're doing sub projects means could be multiple repos associated with a sub project. So we think of notation as the sub project, and then you have tough for the tough implementation or the tough plugin, however you want to think about it. Notation actually has, well, right now it has 3. It has 2 as a notation CLI and a library, which we're hoping actually you'll be able to use as well. And it has a fork of distribution for us to, wait, no, it doesn't. What is maybe there are any forks. So sometimes there might be a fork as a temporary staging place to go upstream. I don't remember. The point is there are at least 2. So in order for us to do any tracking, it kind of needs to be in the root notary project. So rather than have things scattered in a bunch of repos, what we figured was, since you can create multiple projects, let's just create the 2 projects up in the root. And the title should be said something clearly so that people know where to navigate. And we'll figure out the permissions model. There might be some overlap. At the end of the day, there's a trust here. Does that make sense for you? I don't know how deep you've looked at these.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I haven't really looked into, I've never managed a GitHub project board. I've used them, but not like actually organized one before. So I can just figure it out as I go, I guess, but that makes sense to me.
Okay, we're in the same boat. That's kind of, so Samir was drilling into a bunch of questions and I had bumped into some of these as well. So that's the context. And there are scattered projects right now because there's been varied experimentation to realize the edges. And basically Samir is going to take over that whole thing and we'll get it cleaned up and we'll get rid of the old ones. So there'll be a clear way of who's on first. Yeah, so please don't create any new projects in sub repos. Let's create them in the root of Notary. What you do is you literally go to the Notary project org and the projects tab is how you get to there. So Okay, sorry, Samir, I was trying to put some context, so back to you.
No, I think that's perfect. I think that's pretty much it. If people had a chance to read through it, I can share my screen and walk through any questions that somebody has or has put any comments on the doc. Let me share my screen, and hey, keep me on time here. I want to be done in the next 4 minutes, unless we want to spend some more time on looking at the high-level roadmap and disagreeing on what goes in the first GA release or not. So with that, let me just share my screen. And it's always a learning curve on this one, how to share the screen. Okay, share screen 2. Yep, so basically we gave the overview of where we are on a single static roadmap.
Hit the button.
Oh, I hit the button.
There's a confirmation. There you go. I've done that too.
Thanks. So yeah, so the two ways I thought about this is let's write something up. So because people are very familiar with reading things, so it's just a high level list. People can come and read the roadmap.md. It will link to the project boards, and it just gives what our short-term focus is and what our future mid to long-term focus is. On the short-term focus, if people don't disagree, then it is putting an alpha release or one or more versions of the alpha releases out of notation for early feedback and testing. Along with this, we'll keep iterating on the Notary V2 specification towards the first GA release. And of course, we'll do the collaboration with the other projects as Steve is working on. In the mid to long term, which to me is 3 months and longer, we should release the first GA version of the Notary V2 specs and the notation client to go along with it. So on that, I have proposed a high-level content which goes in that first release. This is something which was in a table format the prior time. We talked about it last week, but this time I created issues. I did them in my private repo, and then we can move them here to here very easily if we agree or disagree on it. But I want to spend some time on it. And then and this is an example of something in a sub-project. Let's say in the notation project, we are working towards the notation alpha release, and we can track content for that release individually by using a milestone or by using a project. So this is showing the deeper dive into a sub-project, and I can link it to a project here or just use milestones as one way of doing it. Or if you want to stick to, let me come back here. Yep. So I covered an example of a sub-project. I covered an example of the high-level roadmap, and I talked about how we can statically write our intent. So if people have time, we can go through these two in some more detail. That's my request in this meeting. So let's click on the okay. Let's agree or disagree on the current short-term focus. I just try to limit the number of things I put in here. I believe it's our focus to get multiple alpha, one or more alpha releases out for notation, and as early as possible. And I'm not giving a date right now. We all are working on iterating the Notary V2 spec. No surprises there. Anybody has any comments on this page?
And just to capture some of the concerns, I know sometimes the spec are things like the signature format, what we would do for revocation, what is validation, the high level, those kind of high level goals. And then, the notation CLI and libraries would implement those of the spec. There might be some experiences that get better around that spec, but it's really like, what are the common elements that's kind of what we've been thinking. And then Marina, the idea is that TUF would be able to implement those specs, adding value, and saying, look, here's, and quite frankly, there might be things in the spec that notation didn't implement yet, and TUF is experimenting how to achieve them. I can't get my head wrapped around exactly what that is, but conceptually, that's the framing.
Okay. The best way to read this.
Sorry, Marina, does that make sense? I want to make sure you're good with that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I'll take a look when they're actually being written and see how we can make those things work together. I think there's got to be some, overlap, that kind of thing, but we can make that all. So, yeah.
Yes, Steve, I think I've exceeded my time window I wanted to cover, but I wanted to get alignment on this, but I know I want to yield the floor for somebody else for the topic. And if time permitting, we can come back and look at these items. I can describe it when we come back to it again today, hopefully today itself, but I want to yield the floor to somebody else who has something else to bring up.
I mean, honestly, on this one, I think the biggest thing we've been all, the biggest value this will bring and help the clarity is, what are we working on now? What is it we know we want to do, but we're just not working on right now? And most people will be okay with that. And there's something that's not necessarily okay with it, can start working on it. And maybe as they're making progress, we can bring it in. And just as an example, like we've been talking around, and I'm just picking on it because it was fresh in my mind, the scoping. Like, it's something that looks really super interesting, but we're not sure we want to land it right now. So where we have to validate, we have to get a signature format, and the idea of a policy, to expand on very crude rudimentary configuration is what we have now. What signatures are configured in a JSON file? That's a good thing to get us unblocked. It's not scalable. So, and then including how do you plug in, how do you get the keys to the machine for Key Vault provider plugins? So all I'm trying to say is we want to get a clear framing of here's what we're thinking about the next milestones, so that we can close down on the open issues and know when we're going to focus on the next round. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we're still talking about this, Steve, just to add to what you said, right? So the best way to think about this, these issues or these high-level roadmap items, as I call them, is what are we planning to release as part of the first GA release? So I'm saying we should have release specs and notation support in the first GA release for all of these high-level items. In that same first release, we shall have the spec, but the notation support is optional. So if we get the notation support for revocation signatures, great. But at a minimum, we shall have the spec agreed for how revocation of signatures and certificates will work in the first GA release of the spec. The notation support is optional. So that's the way I think about the first GA release. Anything in these two columns, to me, is the first GA release of the specification, with notation support being optional for items in the second column. On the left-hand side, we see the items we are researching. This was one topic which came up earlier. Let's say, how will we agree on test plans and automated test runs for each release, and the new signature formats. And these are the items in backlog, I think, which require further discussions from where I see it.
So is the idea, so I think, like, setting the bar for what we want to do for a released, and GA tends to be a commercial product term, so I always get angst around the word GA in the community stuff. So I'm open to better ideas. I think we did something, I can't remember what we called it in the ORAS binaries, but I think like setting that bar is perfect, because I think we know what their goal is for us to declare a release, a 1.0. I think the question is then, what are the milestones that we're leading up to that? And then part of those milestones is we want to actually have builds of stable points. So we have notation, for instance, merged into main. If I grab that, first of all, we don't have an automated build yet, so I have to build it myself, pain in the butt. I can do it, but what are the milestones that I can go to the releases tab of GitHub and pull a binary and know, not just the convenience of pulling a binary, but know that that binary is compatible with this ORAS library or this drop of the distribution, run the distribution registry, so that I can test this end to end. So I think getting those milestones declared, so we can say, yep, we've hit milestone 1, we've hit milestone 2. Then
exactly.
we know
Yeah.
progress.
And those milestones will relate to alpha releases and beta releases, and they all lead up to the GA release. So the way I'm thinking about this, each milestone will be a release of either an alpha or a beta variety. At present, our focus is on the alpha releases from where we are today. So I expect multiple versions of the alpha releases to come out and each one of them will have a milestone tag to it that people can look up saying, okay, what does this milestone correspond to? And within each release, as we talked about in the last meeting, we'll have release notes, we'll have the notation CLI, we'll have the specification draft versions. All of them have to come out with that release.
And I'd say automation needs to be, we need to get some automated tests in place too.
Automated testing.
At some point, maybe not this alpha cut because we're just trying to test, but at some point we need to have some kind of, we know that commits are stable.
Okay. So that's where we are. I think when we meet next week, I expect to have what Steve said. We'll have a working backward milestones leading up to our first GA release. And in those list of milestones, you will see one or more alpha releases, one or more beta releases, and milestones. And within each one of them, as Steve pointed out, we need to have automated builds. We need to have some test cases to run against those automated builds. All of those milestones will start showing up there.
So I guess the one question I have on this when we look at the current alpha release is we've got the specs and the definition of the implementation of the Notion alpha. Which of those is leading the other?
Yeah,
that's the sync right now. We want, I think there'll always be some leading and some trailing in both directions, to be fair. We definitely need to catch up, right? Like right now, I can use the notation CLI and I can sign content and I can validate content. It does generate a signature. And there is a payload. It's something that Chiwei did several months ago and we've been using since. Honestly, in all the cases we're just trying to test things out, I don't even know what's in it. I don't care, right? I can validate and test. It could literally say signature true or false, or literally a string of something. But we had something that we were able to learn from. So we definitely want to update the signature spec in the notary project, specs area. So, because I think we've got a place where we're getting together. So we need more coffee. And then, but right now, until that's done, until we can agree on what that markdown is for that signature spec, then let's just leave the notation one the way it is, because it works fine and there's no point in changing it until we know what we're going to change it to. There is a validation API in the notation library right now. It is a proof of concept to let us test out what we think we should be. We should go back and now get the specs to reflect, what does validation mean? How many signatures should it be? If I have 2 signatures from Wabbit Networks, what does that mean? So there are some things around that. And then of course, revocation, what should that be? We don't have revocation in the notation libraries yet. So that's a place where, I don't know what I'll leave there. But I
guess where I'm going with it is if I'm implementing this on my own, it's on my own code, or if I'm looking to be influencing on the direction of where the spec goes, should I be focused on the Notion project to drive that because we're going to implement it there first? Once it proves out and it looks good there, then we say, okay, this is the spec because we proved it out over Notion, or are we going to go the other direction? So that's just where I'm looking for some guidance.
Yeah, I'm laughing because you're calling it Notion versus notation.
Sorry, notation.
So, I'm not sure there's intentional. Anyway. I guess that's for us to decide. I mean, look, registry, just because it's so core to us, the registries were running out for a long time before the spec was done. So I think I don't have a great answer. If your question is if somebody wants to implement something in some other language, that's something we should figure out, like how can we help keep those in sync so we can learn as we're going. If they don't want to use the notation CLI, but they want to do, and they're writing it in Go, I'm hoping the notation Go library is meeting the needs. Like if you're writing in Python, makes perfect sense. But if you're writing in Go, the purpose of the notation Go lib or notation Go repo is to provide that general capability that you can use in OPA or Brandon's magic runtime.
Yeah, something I've found the interesting way, or probably the hard way, is if 2 people look at the specs, they implement them a little bit differently. And so sometimes having a second person implementing this completely isolated can hash out some issues that might need to be either clarified in the spec, or maybe one of the implementations needs fixing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, honestly, that's part of what Marina's doing also, right? She's testing out the limits of what we can do. And that will feed into the specs, and hopefully it'll feed into the libraries and so forth. So it's all good. But to that point, I think that what we're trying to do is the specs are that common piece. So if there are completely two different implementations, we could point back to the specs and like, all right, here's the core, where the handoffs happen between, here's the common terminology.
Okay. And any other questions that Steve and I can address on this? Okay, Steve, if you're the chair.
Milestones being listed in there in one clean central place, so we can start iterating on those and agree what comes in or out, and can, and get back to actually the code writing part, the spec and code writing parts.
But I didn't see any strong pushback on what we consider to be must have for GA. If there was no pushback there, or we don't want to have a discussion right now, we can come back to it later. But I do want to yield the floor. Whoever's the chair today, Steve, if you're the chair, or Justin, you to bring up any other items for today.
That's true. I guess it's Justin as chair today, and he's actually here.
Am I? Oh. Yeah. Has anyone got any other items?
There are other items in the list. So the next one was the automated builds from Maine. So we talked, Sajid and I were talking about it. I actually didn't realize we're further along than I thought. Shiwei's already written the code to do builds like make files and so forth. I thought that was the piece that was missing. What's really missing is what are the little steps that you do to declare a release. So we just did this for the Aura spec, so we can, the artifact spec, so Sajid and I can go back and own that. We'll just write down, here's the steps. And then all we need to do is, once we have milestones defined, once we hit a milestone, we can cut a release, and then we know what everything's in sync with. And when I say everything, to be fair, the specs follow a draft, an RC, where the binaries follow an alpha, beta, and RC. But we want to be able to say which points to which. So for instance, right now, if we were to cut an alpha of the notation binaries, it actually can't point to the signature format because we didn't check that in yet. So, but once the signature format is checked in, then we'll be able to say this release is compatible with this spec. So we want to just get those written down, and then somebody can just label, label a release label a commit, and then we'll
tag a commit even.
What's that?
Tag a commit even.
Thank you, Jesus.
Okay. Yeah, so it would be good to have that done, especially if you've got it somewhere else that you can basically borrow. Sounds good.
So it originally was a call for help, but it turns out Shiwei already did it. So we'll finish it up.
It's probably worth doing a very, just doing a test as well, and just doing it even if it's a very broken pre-alpha.
Yeah, I'd like to. I think that's what we're debating is, should we call the current one an alpha? I mean, I don't know what else to call it younger than an alpha. It's not a beta, and so I think we can take our current one, and maybe that's the conversation we have over the next week. What's in the current build that we think we can't cut an alpha with? Hey, you cannot use this in production. There is nothing stable here. This is simply bang on it so you can give feedback. But here's the binary. Here's the things it points to, because if you want to run it in a registry, this is where you go get the registry implementation, the registry to run it from. And if you wanted to use ORAS to side load and test things, here's the version of ORAS you would use, and so on and so forth. So I'll try to get that done over the next couple of days, so that by next week, whether we do it as part of this meeting or before the meeting, whatever, let's see if we can get a build out of Maine that is declared a Alpha 1. Is that what we're going to call it?
Okay, that sounds good. Third one is location of doc content, issue 1018.
We've had a bit of a discussion on how we want to organize our documentation sets, given we have several sub-projects. The first option on the board is organize them under a docs folder in each repo. And then the other option is to organize the docs canonically under the Notary project.dev repo. So the docs would be built and maintained on the website rather than in the individual sub-projects. My personal preference, and I'm hesitant to sort of go with this first maybe, is that I think having the documentation live under the website is sort of the better way to go. I think that having the docs under the website can complicate some of the writing process or the merging process from the sub-projects, but having a collection there means that you've only got one copy of the documentation. I think that there are sort of quite a few pros to doing that. One of the cons to doing that, one of the pros to doing the other methodology of having it all in one, rather in each sub-project, is that developers can sort of make one PR rather than two PRs to get a change in if it is a documentation changing, affecting change. So I've seen it done sort of both ways, and there are both. My main concern, however we decide to go, is that I would like to see there be only one place that documentation gets changed. If it winds up being two places, I find historically that the documentation origin and the documentation on the website can drift apart, or the automation breaks, or people will change it in the wrong places. I've even seen changes get sort of reverted accidentally because of, again, confusion as to where things need to go. So, but that being said, if the documentation is done in the sub-project area, we can sub-module it in. So there's a couple of options actually. We can sub-module it into the website. We're already sub-moduling the theme into the website, so I mean it's not uncommon or overly onerous to do that. The other option is, especially at the beginning phases, we might link out to the documentation in the repos themselves. That way, again, it's very obvious, okay, this is alpha or beta stage documentation. And then when you want to sort of do a release, then consider, or like a version 1 release, then consider potentially putting it onto the website canonically. So there's sort of several ways to go about it. And I have my preference, but I'm also curious of others.
There's a quite strong preference on the issue for option 1, and I kind of agree, especially now. I actually like your idea of linking out for now and then either submoduling or moving later when things are closer to stable, because I think that and obviously we can put the Notary V1 docs on that basis now because they are stable. Because that kind of gives us a kind of pattern where we can iterate fast while we're in the stage of still very much working on things, and then we can have more canonical kind of release-based docs where we update the docs in line with releases and things later. So kind of that model sounds good. I just realized, sorry, I have to leave now for another call. Marina, could you take over chairing?
Sure, yeah.
Thanks. Sorry.
And I think I agree in terms of the issue. It seems like option one is the more popular. I think Steve, you had mentioned that you were hearing more opposition to it than you were reading opposition to it. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that.
I think this is how these conversations go sometimes. There was as comfortable talking.
Without naming names.
I think, option one has the idea that you merge code with the docs is a very idealistic view, and I think we all would love to do that. I can tell you just in recent days of trying to merge in some of the Hello signing docs where I was really just kind of focused on here's a prototypical line that we would write, and so we should, so we can build the notation libraries and CLIs and experiment to test that. 99% of the feedback came on the English spellings and other things around it. So, which is good, but it wasn't the focus of what we were trying to do at the time. So, and I'm not the best at the writing, and there's others that English is even a first language. So it's kind of, it would be unfortunate to block code because the docs in the same PR, weren't as we would like to be the best experience. Now, you could still put two separate PRs in the same repo. So that's one way to mitigate that. So that was the main thing, was split kind of intentional so they can go on their own. And then after that, that was the majority of the feedback that I had heard. And it resonated with my own. I don't really have a super preference. I think it's a tooling thing that we can do either way. I just would like to close on the issue one way or the other.
Fair enough. So to that point, then, what I'm hearing is option one, and sub-repoing for the Notary project, which is already stable, and then for the other, I guess, two projects, some projects, we will link directly to the repos. So for stable stuff, we will have the documentation on the website, like as a part in the theme of the website. And for things that are still under heavy construction, like notation and I suppose what was the other, the tough, what we'll do is we will on the site header have a link out to notation docs or tough docs that will link directly to GitHub. Does that sound like a...
Say that again. I was trying to type notes and I've suffered from
you can only have your attention in one place. So what I'm hearing is option one, and for stable, already sort of released stuff like notation.
Oh, I wouldn't call notation stable. I think you mean
sorry,
one.
I do mean Notary. My apologies.
Okay.
Notary. I can sub-repo that in, and so that we can have the documentation on the website.
So you would just copy the docs from the Notary repo into the Notary project dev website, you're saying?
Copy, but in a very specific way. What I would do is I would do up a Git sub module, so that when we do a release cycle on the website, we would pull in the fresh docs from Notary as they are in the repo. For alpha level and sub projects that are on like under active construction, what I would suggest is that in the website header, we have a link to the GitHub repo. So for notation,
Oh, I see.
we'd have like a notation docs link that would link directly to Notary project /notation/docs. And that way it's very obvious, hey, this is still under construction. We're not even going to bring these into the website. It's very obvious this is where the work is going and where you should be looking for this type of stuff. The one thing about suggesting that is keeping in mind that if we do bring the notary docs in this way, we will need to make some changes, particularly around links and stuff like that, in order to make the notation documentation work within the website. Right. If we go with the idea of, okay, bringing it in without copying it, right? And this is where I get back to having like one place for documentation to live, because if we start saying, okay, the notation documentation is living under notation/docs, but is being brought into the website, then the first space is the location where all of the changes have to be made, including things like linking to other pages, which when you look at it from the Git repo stance, no longer makes any sense because it could be linking to another page on the website. But if we start making sort of changes between the two, that's where I'm saying things will diverge and it'll become it'll get messy. So am I hearing what am I saying what I think? Rather, I think this. Am I saying what you agree is the solution to close this particular issue? If you could parse that. Sorry,
it sounds complex, but I want to hear what others think.
Yes.
I think for me, any of these work. I think it is easier to have the docs and code be committed at the same, like be included in the same PRs where possible. But I think as long as they're just in one place for each project, I don't care too much what that one place is. I think it should be easy enough to organize. I guess the other challenge would be making sure that the right people have, maintainer access to all the right places where the docs are corresponding to the code. But I think that's a solvable problem. So.
Yeah, my impression from here in the description is that we're going to have a Git submodule for the stable projects. We're going to have just links to the Git repos. So it sounds like all the docs are going to be in the individual projects, regardless of whether it's a submodule or a link.
That's what it sounds like to me. That's what it seems like you folks want. And I'm here to make what you folks want happen. But I also want my life to not be crazy. So
this needs to be a scalable solution. We can't have you be the doc master for the rest, for every commit. Right.
Well, this is where it's interesting actually talking about releases, because as you're like the documentation, if I may be so bold, needs to be a part of the release process, because if you have something that works and is great, but nobody knows how to use, then you're in trouble, or the user might be in trouble. So building these systems out, like at this point, this is in other projects. For instance, Kubernetes has several of these sub projects as well, like Notary project. And they have one spot where the documentation sort of lives. It's on the website, and it's canonically on the website. And during their release cycle, what they do is they say, okay, for any feature that is going to be a part of the release, at the beginning of that process, there has to be a placeholder documentation PR done against the website. And if the feature and the documentation PR aren't done a feature can be dropped if the documentation isn't finished. And that I think is actually appropriate because again, if you have a new feature, but you haven't documented it, it's of little value, right? Or can be, I should say.
So I'll throw this out there and we can decide. It feels like trying to put it as the docs in the same repo makes it more complicated for the back end to keep the docs website in sync, because we're trying not make the Git repos the documentation places. We're trying to make them the source of code that we would commit to, code being specs and markdown files as well. I think what I'm hearing is the only downside to putting the docs in the doc folder is permission boundaries. That's a relatively solvable problem because, if Marina puts something horribly wrong in the other folder, well, that's an easy thing to understand, no different than it's in the other project, whatever that means. So I know that Justin, and it's unfortunate that Justin dropped off, but if we make the permissions work, the maintainers of the sub-projects have access to the Notary Project Dev website. Does that simplify things so that we're not creating hell for the back end for Nate? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I feel like we're
Git permissions. You can. I've actually set up the notaryproject.dev repo using the Git settings integration. So you can actually change who is on who has permissions to the website repo with a PR. The dot settings, rather .github/settings YAML file has a list of people who have got access. So it's actually very easy to update the permissions on that.
And Marina, to your question, like you want them to be in sync, you could cross-link the two PRs across the two, and we should have the same approvers on both. Whether how much detail that people work on, look at both, I don't know.
I mean, it is two different PRs though, and I think there's a tendency, I think, in general among people to write the code and not the documentation. And if you add extra barriers, it makes that tendency more prevalent. I think we can just make policies and stuff so to encourage people to do it, and I think that might work.
I won't cut a release if the appropriate level of docs aren't there. But at the same token, I wouldn't want to block a code check-in for testing something because the comma's in the wrong place, or and all of those things that should be fixed. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't fix those docs, but to decouple those and say, and when Samir's got the list of milestones, we could say, because we'll be able to span sub-projects, we can say, here's the list of issues that need to be resolved before we cut the release.
So are you suggesting two PRs, you checking your code and then you do the doc check-in? Is that what you're going for, Steve?
I'm suggesting option 2 because it scares the hell out of me to how much process we're going to create for Nate on the back end and how things can get out of sync. And we solve the permissions boundary so that's a non-issue.
So if you're pushing for that case and we block a release because the docs aren't there, who is the one responsible for updating the docs?
Basically what I'm saying is we have a set of maintainers that span the projects, and we're in the spirit of collaboration here. There shouldn't be any problem on solving that. And we will give the maintainers of the TUF and the notation project access to the dev website, the Notary Project Dev website.
Okay, so it's Marina is responsible every time I submit a change to TUF to go out and document my change.
No, you make the PR. Absolutely. You make the PR to that. It's just,
but if I don't, we're still going to
If you
accept
don't,
the code.
He made a PR before I merged this or something.
Yeah. She can decide, I will use her as an example. She can decide, I'm not merging your code change until the docs are in good shape. And before she's ready to hit the merge button on docs, she won't merge, it won't hit the merge button on your code until the docs are in shape. That's her call to make. No different than it
shape-
was in the same PR or two PRs in the same repo. Yeah, go Nate.
And in shape can be a dynamic understanding as well. So in shape for an early draft of something is different from in shape for, okay, it's time to cut version 1.0. And so pulling like if you're merging something to do some tests and whatnot, and the documentation is something along the lines of this exists with poor punctuation, that can be fine for that state if we have different sort of versions going. Versioning actually and localization are the other two big reasons I would push for having a separate repo for documentation, just because I think all three of these are going to get versioned sort of differently, and managing different versions in a repo can be fairly straightforward, but localization I think would be nightmarish in their separate repo. I think that, and again, this is stuff for way further down the line potentially. I think localization would be very difficult with
Versioning itself is complicated in general. So if we have version 0.1 and 0.2, is the website going to have that option to differentiate the two? And if I submit a pull request onto 0.1 that someone wants to merge into 0.2, do they have to now go out and grab the documentation change and copy that over as well?
Yes. Well, I mean, yes. And if you look at etcd.io, that's a site I've worked on fairly recently and have planned this site on. It has versions, and what we do with that is we got in the content folder each version going back, I think 4 or 5 versions that they support. And generally speaking, the current version is the sort of where changes happen. We often have a sort of a next version available as well. It's not currently there right now. And then the other thing that will happen is any prior version we say is not deprecated, but it's provided as an archive. And so new features don't necessarily get backported, but if something is found to be incorrect in the documentation, then it can be fixed. Kubernetes does it a little bit differently. They actually, instead of doing a subfolder version, they actually do a sub URL. So they'll have Kubernetes as their main one, and they'll have like k18.kubernetes as their previous version, and the entire site is then versioned. So if you're looking at an older version of the documentation, you'll also only see the blog up to whenever that version was cut. And the way they do that is with feature branches, which is a little bit, again, more complex. But I believe they do the same thing where they say, okay, older versions are archival, except for mistakes. And they will actually go back and pull, make PRs against the feature branch if they need to correct something, but they won't necessarily go back for features. So yes, versioning is complex, or can be.
But looking, and I pasted a couple of links, looking at the sites that you did for etcd, and even I realized even in Notary Project, in the Notary Project.dev, if I click on that link, at first I didn't see the version drop down. I saw versions, but it was grayed out. If I go to the Docs tab, now I start to see drop downs for it. So to your point, Brandon, it could be v0.1 or whatever. It's whatever string gets stuck in there, like he's got on the etcd site.
Yeah, for the versions, I wanted to keep the menu consistent, so it's grayed out on pages that don't actually have a version under it.
Gotcha.
So that's why it sort of pops in there.
So Nate, when you talk about doc versions, those doc versions relate to the spec, like Notary V1, Notary V2. Is that the way you're thinking, or docs will have subversions as well?
I put together the put together the site before we had made the decision to change from Notary V1 and Notary V2 to Notary and Notation. And so I need to update that. And I've got a PR that is working through some of the nomenclature changes. So I would think that instead of being docs V1 and docs V2, what I would suggest is /docs tough /docs/notary and /docs/notation. And under each of those, I would have the version of what I guess you would call the spec. So it would be, these URLs will get a bit ornery, but you copy and paste them, it should be fine. You go docs notation 0.1, right? Or, excuse me, docs notary, what is it at, like 1.6 or something? I can't remember the versions exactly, but it's, so the versioning would be under each project's subfolder in the repo, in the website repo under content.
Okay. Thanks.
My only other thought is, we've said from the beginning, we needed subject matter expertise from lots of trades. I'm hearing the doc person tell us we should do, basically option 2. I'm kind of struggling to fight against that when the only thing that I've heard as a con is it's not the only, the main thing was the permissions. We can solve that. And while it's nice to be able to commit, docs and code at the same time, I found that's rarely happened. And Marina, if you're that organized, and I hope you are, sorry, the point is, like, it's a very good goal. And if it can be done, awesome. Just keep the 2 PRs in sync. So does anybody veto that approach?
I'm not a fan of it, but I threw my comment in the issue, so I'll just leave it there.
I think the weight, I'm just kind of leaning on the subject matter expert here, and he's got a pretty good process set up for that. So if there's no major objections, because the other part of this is, like, we spent a lot of time talking about 2 big process things, which is the things we really need to do to get this project kind of more organized so people know where to focus. But we do need to get this stuff in place so that we can actually start making progress on other specific things that we've been working on. So having the project the board in place so we know what we're focused on, having the doc process in place. Nothing's ever perfect. It's good enough. And let's move forward. Yeah, go Nate.
To that point about the project board, would you, right now I've got a documentation or website project board running in notary project /notaryproject.dev. You want me to bring that up a level? So
yeah, let's the lesson learned is move everything up, because if you move it up to the root project, you can also track doc issues in the individual repos, because that'll solve the concerns about things that are in the project specific repos. You shouldn't have to track an issue in the doc website per se. We should, but if Marina wants to track something in Tough that's a doc issue, let her track it there, tag it as docs, and we can get it on the docs project board as well. She can actually decide how she wants to manage it, honestly. And I'm sorry, Marina, I'm picking on you as a focus person for something other than me or whatever. Just, we should be able to separate these things out. Separate them out, yet the project boards can see all the repos. And
can we have a contributing, can we have a contributing guidance on the docs PR, or whenever somebody opens a PR, we need to have a way to describe where to go and to submit the doc update as well, if we are splitting those up.
Are you suggesting adding information to like issue templates or PR templates?
Yes, exactly. With a pointer to the docs contributing guidelines.
Which I think I need to write still.
It may look silly for me to ask this question, but can we list the docs upfront as to what are the docs which will go in? I want to understand what all docs we're talking about here. I think I have a rough idea, but if we list to see what docs you're thinking, Nate.
The doc set that I think exists are the notary docs, the original set that came over from the update frameworks repo fairly recently, which actually looked like they were built for a Hugo site. So they actually should translate fairly well. There's the upcoming, presumably tough docs, which I think, I'm not sure that there are any there just yet, but eventually that is a second set. And then the third set are the notation docs. I haven't considered Notation Go or like the CLI type stuff yet, but I would hazard that those, if we go the docs repo, like if we call it the website repo, like consider it like the docs repo. I would think that any CLI or any sub-project type documentation should probably also go into the website. Again, just there's a lot of value for discoverability and tooling around that. So those are the three main doc sets. But if there's a fourth or a fifth, then please let me know.
Yeah, I think Nate's sorry to push this, but my point on the docs was not the categories, but like it's the user guide, it's the troubleshooting guide, it's the, because the specs will stay in the repos, right? You're not pulling the specs into the docs, or are you?
I don't believe so, because the spec is the, and forgive me if I'm incorrect, but the spec is the work of the development you're doing. Is that?
No, by specs, I'm not looking at the code or the make files or the Go implementation of it. By specs, I'm saying what is the signature format we agreed to? That's the specification I'm talking about.
I would, if I were, so the question is, if somebody who wants to use your system is coming to the website and saying, hey, I've got these four options for doing this, what do I need to know in order to get the system up and running? And if having a spec as a part of the website is like a step that you need, like if you're going through and it's like, oh, this is part of it, then it should be on the website. And I actually do have I believe it is well out of date at this point, an information architecture issue opened where I would like your all's feedback, because I'm not the expert in how this should all go together. I can help you write it. I can help you build the website, but in terms of answering that specific question, I always defer to thinking about what the user would need to see in order to get what their task is done. And so if the spec is a part of that, then it should probably be in the website, because otherwise you're saying, okay, here's information about Notary, but then you have to go over here to get this other piece. And then if you have to then go back to the website to get to step 6 and 7, that can be problematic. Right. But again, I don't have the same depth of knowledge on that as you folks do. So maybe that is appropriate. I don't know.
Just time check. Folks are starting to drop off. So I put it in the notes. Let's go with option 2. for another reason than the subject matter expert says that's the way to go, and all this falls on Nate, and we want to be able to leverage it going forward. So just to have something closed, that's like I said, there wasn't any major objections, so let's go with that. And I put an action item in the notes that we should go change the contributing guidance on how that should get done. So with that, we'll start to see more structure in our stuff, and we'll continue our progress, our journey. And I hope these will get, we will get these things done, and we can get the in-depth conversations on the policy and blah, 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 and feature X, Y, and Z. So till next week. Thanks, folks.
Thanks.